Hi, this is Jeremy Jansen, and welcome to another issue of Reason Wizardry, this time for April 2011. This month, we're going to be looking at Subtractor again, and in particular, how to take one of the main sound design features from Subtractor and perform that same feature in Thor. The feature that I'm talking about is the phase offset. And we've talked about this before, both in the Subtractor issue and in the past, how this is a really interesting feature of Subtractor that isn't featured in Thor. And once again, I'll give a quick explanation of how this feature works. Basically, what's happening is when you push the phase mode to either duplicate or subtract, it creates a duplicate waveform. So in this case, it would create a second saw waveform, and it will either subtract that saw waveform from the original, or it will multiply it. So I'm just going to bring in the Reason manual here, just so that you can visualize what's happening. So the original saw waveform is in blue, and then a second saw waveform is in brown. And so you can see it slightly later in time or offset. And with the subtraction mode, you get a result like this, and that tends to sound like pulse width modulation. With the multiplication mode, you get something that's more complex and less predictable. So for this issue, I am going to show you how to do this phase subtraction in Thor. As for the phase multiplication, we're going to save that for a later issue. Well, the truth is I actually haven't figured that one out yet. If you have any ideas, email me. Alright, so we're going to start by listening to phase offset subtraction in Subtractor, just so we can determine exactly how it sounds and how best to bring that into Thor. So I'm going to play a few notes here, and we're starting out with a triangle waveform, and I've got phase offset subtraction on. So it's an extremely subtle effect with a triangle waveform. Let's try a sine. It's completely inaudible there. How about this first wavetable waveform? You get more of a distinct pulse width modulation effect. Now back to the saw. First without any of the phase offset. That's a saw. And now with the subtraction, it's completely silent at this end. And at that end, it's a 100% square waveform. We can change to a square right here, turn off the phase offset, and they're identical. It's a little bit louder with phase offset on the saw. Okay, so we're going to try to recreate this effect in Thor. And before I do that, I'm just going to discuss why you might want to do this. It's not just an academic exercise, but it's interesting to bring this effect to Thor because we have a much wider range of oscillators. We can perform this kind of fake pulse width modulation on wavetable oscillators, phase modulation, FM, and the multi-oscillator, which is one that I've found has a really great effect. If we use the multi-oscillator saw waveform, we can get pulse width modulation, which otherwise isn't possible with the square waveform using the multi-oscillator. So there's a variety of interesting reasons why we'd like to attempt something like this. and that covers most of them. So now let's get on with the attempt. We're going to start out with the analog oscillator in saw mode. So first we need to mentally walk ourselves through what we need to happen in Thor. First, we need to create a duplicate waveform of the saw. Then we need to offset that waveform very slightly in time, and then we need to take that offset waveform and subtract it from the first. So there's 3 different steps there. So beginning with the first step, we're going to create a duplicate waveform very simply, and that's by just sending this analog oscillator through both filters. So by doing this, we're creating an exact duplicate of the analog oscillator that's being run through a different signal path, which will be important for what comes next. Now, the next part is figuring out how to offset this duplicate waveform in time against the first waveform. And there's a couple ways that you might think to do it that involve perhaps routing audio outside of Thor, routing it through maybe a delay device, whether it's the DDL or the RV7000, and then routing it back. But let me tell you, that's not going to work because none of them have a short enough delay time. We need a very, very small and short offset. So we have a device that's actually tailor-made for this, and that is the comb filter. A comb filter is essentially a very, very fast delay. When it's at low values, let's just turn on our Thor here and mute off the subtractor. And activate the signal path that sends this comb filtered sound out to the amplifier. So at low frequencies, this is a slower delay, and at high frequencies, it's a faster delay. So what we need to do now is find out the exact delay time, or well, with the comb filter, it's listed in frequency hertz, that we need to use in order to get this exact offset that's going to match the offset that the subtractor uses. So I can save us some time here. I A/B'd the subtractor and the Thor and found out that likely the ideal value is 449 hertz. So we can just dial that in. And that saves you about 10 minutes of listening to 2 saw waveforms against each other. Hurts the ears a little bit, to be honest. Okay, so now let me activate this first signal path again. And you can hear that we have 2 waveforms, one offset against the other. That's why it kind of sounds phasey. So that covers the first 2 steps of creating a duplicate waveform and then offsetting it slightly. So we'll tackle the last step, which is pretty much the most non-intuitive, in the next chapter. All right, so now we're at the step where we need to subtract the duplicate waveform from the original. And to do that, we're going to use something called phase cancellation. And the basics of the phase cancellation theory is if we take one waveform and then add a second waveform that's the complete opposite phase, they'll cancel each other out and you'll get silence. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually demonstrate that and how you can do that in Thor, and then we'll take that theory and apply it to our patch. So I'm going to actually turn this off, not sending out this signal path to the amplifier, and I'm going to just temporarily temporarily remove this filter. And now what I'm going to do is add a mod matrix entry here, filter 2, going to the amp input. Okay, so right now let's just hear what it sounds like. We should have a single saw waveform. Now if we send this filter 2 onto the amplifier, you just get a louder waveform because you're just sending a double of the waveform. But now we can actually send it out of phase to the amp if we use a negative amount. And you'll actually hear how that will actually turn our first waveform into silence as we raise it all the way to 100. So I'm pushing the keys here, but it's completely silent because we've got a waveform that's identical to the original waveform, but 100% out of phase, being sent to the amplifier. So they're canceling each other out. So we're going to use that same theory with our comb filter, and what that will do is subtract the second duplicate and offset waveform from the original waveform. So you can hear there already, that's our saw waveform that's being subject to this phase cancellation isn't silent because that second waveform is slightly offset. The comb filter is offsetting that waveform. So instead of getting silence, we're getting a more square waveform that's caused by the phase cancellation. So what we have here is essentially the phase offset synthesis that is originally from Subtractor. All we need to do now is figure out a way to get its range. Well, first we need to map it to a rotary and then get that rotary's range of effect to match up somewhat similarly to this phase rotary in Subtractor. So we'll save that for the next chapter. Okay, so now we're going to do some rotary mapping to try to get a very similar effect to the phase rotary in Subtractor. So let's head over to the Thor mod matrix and we'll get our first rotary mapping here, rotary 1 at 50 to the filter 2 frequency. Right now, we should probably go back to the Subtractor and listen to the two extremes of the rotary's motion so that we can kind of hear how we need to match that in Thor. So let's solo that off. So at one extreme, we've got that completely square waveform getting progressively thinner and then completely silent at the other end. So what I want to do first is target that completely square waveform because I don't think we have it right yet. It's not exact. So that's what I'm going to use this rotary one for. That will just be fine-tuning our completely square end of the rotary range. So let's listen here. That sounds very much like a square waveform. Let's Let's A-B between the two here. It's a little bit brighter on the subtractor, but other than that, I think it's identical. Okay, so now let's bring Rotary 2 into play, and this is actually going to be the control that replaces the phase rotary from Subtractor. So we'll map this one 100, and we're going to leave this first rotary at 38. So now so it doesn't get completely silent at the end of its range like the Subtractor rotary does, but it's very close. It gets very thin. We can A-B between these once again. Say about there, that's a value of 4 on the Subtractor. So that's very similar, I'd say. So what we have here then is the phase rotary. The only catch is that the range is reversed. We have silence, or the thinness, fully right, and we have the square. We have the square fully left. I don't see that as a problem, so I'm just going to leave it that way. You could reverse it and invert it if you like. Okay, so we have brought phase offset modulation to Thor. It's virtually identical to the Subtractor variant. And now, as I said before, we can try phase offset modulation on some other waveforms that don't exist in Subtractor. So let's give that a try. First, let's head over to the multi-oscillator, get the multi-saw waveform, and let's just listen to that first. Actually, you know what? Let's create a button mapping here to turn on and off phase offset modulation. If we turn off this mapping right here, or scale it to 0, we will have no phase offset. If we don't send any of this filter 2 to the amp input, we'll just have this signal path. So we can do that very easily by adding this scalar to button 1. So you can hear that the phase offset rotary does nothing in this case. So let's add phase. There we go. Okay, so you can pretty much hear it here. We've got pulse width modulation on the multi-oscillator with a square-like waveform, and that isn't possible, to my knowledge, any other way. Let's add a little bit of chorus, hear what this sounds like in stereo. And of course, one of the most useful things you can do with pulse width modulation is simply add LFO modulating it. So we can do that as well by taking LFO1 and sending that to filter 2 frequency as well. We can send it, let's say, at about 70 or so, and we'll turn the rate down unsynced, and turn off that course for just a minute. So personally, I think this whole exercise is worth it in and of itself, just to get that sound out of the multi-oscillator. Now let's continue to add some modulators here by turning the LFO on and off using the second button here. So we'll quickly map that by adding the button 2 as a scalar for the LFO to filter frequency. All right, let's continue on and hear what some other different oscillators sound like through this technique. Let's try the wavetable oscillator, and how about the bell oscillator? All right, now for the FM pair. So you can hear it kind of adds some hollowness to any waveform, and it adds kind of like fake pulse width modulation to anything. Some waveforms it's more effective on than others, but just about any waveform will give you an interesting effect that isn't typical from what you usually get out of Thor. Finally, keep in mind that you can use multiple oscillators, and if you set it up correctly, you can do pulse width modulation on all of them simultaneously. So let's keep this FM pair, add that wavetable back in. Let's try that bell again. And let's add that saw waveform that we tuned this technique with originally. And all we have to do is send all of them through both sides of the signal path, and we'll get pulse width modulation on everything. That's without. Now I should mention some of the downsides of using this phase offset modulation in Thor. And the main one is that it kind of takes over your filtering signal path, and you can't add a filter as you normally would. So we're using this comb filter, so obviously we can't put anything different in that spot, but we can't add anything to filter 1 either. If we add a low pass filter here, well, then this signal path is going to be filtered, but this one won't be. So no longer will the waveforms be identical except for their phase. So it just won't work anymore. And for that reason, we can't put any low pass filters or any other filters in the signal path in filter 1 or filter 2. All we can do is use filter 3 for a low pass. Which is okay, except for keep in mind that filter 3 is monophonic in that it processes all the voices at once, and it's driven by the global envelope. So that might not be the effect that you're looking for. Each voice won't have its own separate filter envelope. And so for monophonic sounds, if we were going to just use one polyphony and use it for basses or leads, that'd be totally fine. But when you want to do, sweeping strings, polyphonic string type patches and stuff, it's not really ideal to have a monophonic filter. So unfortunately, I can't see a workaround to get a filter in the polyphonic signal path. So we have to settle for using it here. So that's the first downside. And the second downside is obviously that we're using these two rotaries here, and they can't be used for anything else. Now, it might be possible to remove this first rotary that we're using for fine tuning, but I wasn't able to get enough resolution setting the frequency just directly on the comb filter frequency knob. So I don't think that you can get away without using this rotary. What you could do is create another Thor and then use its rotary and send that out through a CV signal into this Thor. And that would free up this rotary, and actually could free up this other one as well. But of course, that means then you're going to package this patch as a combinator rather than as a single Thor. So if you're okay with that, then there's plenty of ways. You can create as many Thors as you want and send those CV signals in and use many different rotaries for many different modulations in your patch. But if you just want to have this effect in a Thor with no combinator surrounding it, then you're somewhat limited in that you're losing these two rotaries to the phase offset modulation. So that brings us to the end of the April 2011 issue of Reason Wizardry. Now, hopefully at the end of this issue, you aren't thinking, oh, finally I can throw away Subtractor, because of course it's still got some interesting features that I haven't been able to figure out how to bring to Thor. And beyond that, it's still very quick and easy to program. And if you listen to our CPU usage issue, what was that? Something like 3,000 voices you can get out of it. So it takes virtually no CPU at all. But if you like that phase offset modulation and you want to try that in Thor, then I hope you found this issue informative, and I hope that you can use some of these patches as a starting point for where you'd like to take Thor with phase offset modulation. I'll be back next month with something hopefully equally as cool. As always, please email me if you have some ideas in mind for future issues. Thanks again for watching. Until next month, I'm Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.